Feminist retellings of classic stories are in vogue. Jennifer Saint's much anticipated debut novel, which came out this spring, is about the dilemma that Ariadne, Princess of Crete, faces over to whether to kill the Minotaur, her brother, for the sake of Prince Theseus of Athens, whom she loves. As the promotional materials put it, Ariadne gives a voice to the forgotten women of one of the most famous Greek myths and speaks to their strength in the face of angry, petulant gods. The blurb puts Ariadne in good company within a recent tradition of feminist retellings on both sides of the Atlantic, claiming, quote, Jennifer Saint joins the likes of Madeline Miller and Pat Barker in forging mesmerising retellings of ancient Greek myths from a female perspective. Miller and Barker both wrote novels that were shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2019. Madeline Miller's Circe, which has recently been greenlit for an HBO Max series, retells events told in Homer's Odyssey from the perspective of the witch Circe. And Pat Barker's The Silence of the Girls tells the story of how Briseis, a captured queen handed over to Achilles, views the events of Homer's Iliad. One more example, from Old English rather than Greek epic, is Maria Dahvana Headley's The Mere Wife, published in 2018, which is billed as a fierce feminist retelling of the classic tale Beowulf. It's a smart, fast novel that recasts Grendel's mother, a villain in the Old English epic Beowulf, as an ex-marine who lives in the wild with her son Gren. Their lives collide violently with the inhabitants of a nearby gated community called Hare at Hall, since it was written with Hollywood adaptation in mind. While feminist retellings may have gone mainstream in the UK and USA, the same cannot yet be said, I would say, of feminist translation. I'm using feminist in a broad sense here to describe retellings of translations of classic texts that take account of the experience of women across time in ways that challenge sexism and the oppression of women. The term feminist translation is especially associated with the work of scholars and translators in Canada in around the 1990s, and also and later, such as Sherry Simon, Louise von Flotow, and what I have to say draws on their writings implicitly. Feminist translation is not only not popular, I sense it also makes people a bit queasy. And it's this queasiness that I want to prod at and think through a little bit in what I have to say here. One reason for this nervousness, I think, is the commonly held view that translation is the one-off creation of a new version of a text in another language that will stand the test of time and be useful to readers in another language if it's done in a neutral way and the translator tries to be invisible. For example, most English readers of the Italian novelist Elena Ferrante's work probably want to forget that they're reading a translation and instead feel that they're reading Ferrante's original words as far as possible, not her English translators Anne Goldstein's work. And indeed, Anne Goldstein has written and spoken about trying not to intrude her own thoughts, her own phrasings on the reader so they can have that experience of reading Ferrante for themselves. I think Goldstein offers a helpful reminder that female translators are not necessarily feminist translators, nor that gender will necessarily be a central consideration in the work of individual translators who are women or identify as any other gender. The implication for a translation of, say, Homer's Iliad is that there's a basic distinction between wanting to read Pat Barker's rewriting of the Iliad and then a translation that should just let us read Homer's words as though he were living in a present-day English-speaking country and spoke modern English. It follows, in this view, then, that translation should give us the original text without any colouring, feminist or otherwise. And I think from that point of view, feminist translation sounds like something to be suspicious of. Why would we need or want a feminist translation of a classic text? I think there's another reason that feminist translation might make us feel a little bit uncomfortable and uneasy. And that's because I think it speaks to one of the key questions of our times, and that's how should we deal with aspects of the past that don't fit our present day values, our present day sensibilities, whether that's about gender or race or social inequality, or how violence and subjugation underpin the prosperity of former colonial powers. One solution is to end this talk here. That's one solution, it'll be short, but that's one. And just ignore such texts and consign them to the library and leave them there. But feminist translation speaks to another approach, one that doesn't neglect these works, nor pass over moments in which women characters are silenced or overlooked, or just presented as mere playthings of men. Instead, the phrase feminist translation makes me think about ways that English translations might encourage critical engagement with oppression, with the patriarchal, androcentric structures and traditions of representation that these texts from the past embody and arguably have helped perpetuate into our present moment. I want to explore three kinds of feminist translation of earlier texts, considering what these linked strategies offer us in thinking and navigating about aspects of the past that might be unpleasant or embarrassing or offensive or inconsistent with our beliefs that we might hold today, and many readers today hold. I'll introduce a couple of short examples for each of the three kinds, including examples that take us right back to the earliest days of women translating in English to be printed in the middle of the 16th century in England. These earlier examples will show us that these aren't new questions, and they'll also give us a broader range of approaches that we might think about and possibilities, so that then when I come back towards the end to a couple of recent examples of translations that we might want to call feminist translations, we can then think about how those fit in a wider history. The first kind of feminist translation that I want to introduce is adding or supplementing new words, new ideas to the original text. This kind challenges the view that translators should be invisible, should be neutral, and instead claims that there's nothing inherently wrong with adding new insights, new perspectives to a text, just as Jennifer Saint or Madeline Miller or any other creative writer might do. This view recognises that translation is a creative art and that translators aren't just neutral intermediaries. I think it's good reason for being aware of that as a kind of translation. Translating a poem is not the same as translating a signpost in the street or translating a takeaway menu. Von Flotow, one of the Canadian critics that I've just mentioned, argues that, quote, supplementing is one of the most positive aspects of translation. She quotes a classic essay called The Task of the Translator by a German critic and theorist, Walter Benjamin, arguing that according to Benjamin, the source text, such as Homer's work, the original work, is supplemented by its translation, matured, developed, and given an afterlife. This is precisely what happens with supplementation in feminist translation. And then she adds that feminist translation, the female translator, is conscious of a political role as a mediator. This first vision of feminist translation stresses the translator's agency and the difficulty of being that neutral intermediary. And it also speaks in a way that I find attractive to how texts grow over time, closer to representing a wider range of views, a wider range of human experience in our present day. This can be done in ways that are subtle or ways that are not subtle. It could be done by touching up the original in small places, or it can be done by hijacking, by taking over the original work and offering something new. It's potentially quite straightforward to do, and it's something that we can find across English literary history. In fact, we can find examples in the work of one of the very first women to have a collection of poetry printed in her name. It's a poet called Isabella Whitney. Whitney probably doesn't know any foreign languages, but in a poem called A Sweet Nosgay, a nosgay is a bunch of flowers, that's first printed in 1573, she turned a selection of prose maxims by another contemporary writer, Sir Hugh Platt, into a series of just over 100 quatrains, 4-line poems of verse. And as she translates from prose to verse, she expands the frame of reference here and there, so that Platt's flowers grow further, as it were, to acknowledge the experience of women as well as men. The result, to me, feels like it's drawing on Whitney's personal experience and is adding, again, depending on how you read it, sort of deliberately tilted, satirical, slightly subversive reading of those original maxims. Now, there's just one version of the 1573 text that survived, and that's sometimes a bit hard to read. It's in black letter as well. So I'll be quoting from a modern transcription by a critic called Michael David Felker. I'm going to give a couple of examples of Whitney's work. We find an example of how Whitney adds to Platt's maxims in the 68th of Whitney's short poems, which expresses the idea that if you get hurt while in love, well, then you should go to the person who inflicted that blow to seek a remedy, to seek cure for that blow. Whitney writes, "If love have given thee a blow, and that thou art unsound, make means that ye a plaster have of them which gave the wound." Now, this universal application doesn't specify any genders about who's inflicting the wound or who's suffering the wound, and that's building upon Platt's original maxim, which does specify that. Platt's maxim reads, "The best physician to heal the lover's wound is she that struck the blow." That phrase is implicitly spoken from a man's perspective, assuming that the blow will be struck by a woman. Whitney's version expands the application, the frame of reference, to show there is not just those with she, her pronouns that might inflict blows within a relationship. A few stanzas later, in the 76th of Whitney's poem, Whitney takes on a maxim in which Platt says that lovers only live through the bodies of the ones they love. The lover is dead in his own and lives in another's body. I just sense Whitney sort of scratching her head, smiling wryly as she reads this, because she seems to have little time for this sentiment. She mocks the phrase in her retelling, adding a couplet, 2 lines, that reframes that whole sentiment of Platt's. She observes, quote, "that affection fond deceives the wise, and loves makes men such noddies or simpletons that they would believe Platt's maxim that to themselves they seem as dead, yet live in others' bodies." She's not just copying Platt, she's creating a new frame there, in this case, commenting on it, commenting on the noddiness, the foolishness of men, and recasting the gender roles that Platt's maxims implicitly support, underlying them. If Whitney's style of translation is appealing to us today, 400 years later, then that's at least partly because readers are more interested in reading what Whitney has to say as an early modern women poet than Sir Hugh Platt's platitudinous original maxims. Similarly, but more recently, we might think of the classical translator Anne Carson as someone who people want to read for her creative readings of Catullus' poem 101 in her work Knox, or Sophocles' play Antigone in Antigonic, a comic book version. Both are much more than a literal translation of either text and are closer to creative responses such as those we began with, or say the work of Caroline Duffy, to offer another example of a poet. Now, at this point, this might send you wanting to pause and head straight to your nearest online bookshop. At the same time, though, I can hear possible doubts that you might have in mind. This approach tends to work best when you already know the original work, so you know what's being added and where it's being added. You've already got that knowledge. In many cases, it's probably best if you're aware of what's going on, and maybe if the translator announces that ideas, that thoughts are being added to the original. And modern readers who do want to read Sophocles or Catullus or even Hugh Platt are likely to prefer translations that intervene in ways that are marked as such, rather than giving an impression of being a straightforward rewriting of the original text. And this takes me straight into the second kind of feminist translation, again following the ideas of von Flotow here, which is translations that have prefaces, footnotes, or other material surrounding a text that offers another voice with a feminist perspective on the original work. This can work with what we've just seen, with supplementing translations that then have an introduction that explain what is going on in that translation, so it's clear to the reader what to expect. Or, again, if you look back in the past, it can work with an introduction that, say, justifies a woman's right to translate at all. And that's exactly what we find if we take another example from the 1570s, hundreds of years ago, in the work called The Mirror of Princely Deeds and Knighthood from 1578 by one M.T. on the title page. And if you turn over to the epistle dedicatory, the dedicatory epistle, that is signed Margaret Tyler. And Tyler's short address to the reader that then follows in 2 pages of black letter type, it can be quite hard to read if you're not practiced in doing it, that's often been read as a proto-feminist defence of the right of women to translate. And near a side note halfway down the first page that reads that a woman may write of war, Tyler explains that, "I hope thou will friendly accept it," the translation, "the rather for that it is a woman's work, though in a story profane," i.e. not a religious one, a secular work, it's a romance that she's translating, "and a matter more manlike than becometh my sex." It's a work about war and battle. It's associated, especially in this period, with the activities of men. But as for the manliness of the matter, of wars and so forth, thou knowest that it is not necessary for every trumpeter or drummer in the war to be a good fighter. In other words, there's no reason that a woman cannot translate a story about an apparently manly topic like war, and that's quite true. Translators don't need to have a biographical, demographic resemblance to the author of the work that they're translating. So this preface frames her translation by introducing that she's a young woman, with, as she then says in the concluding section, that it's neither unseemly for a woman to deal in translation, neither greatly requiring a less staid age than mine is. And so thus, in this preface, in this introduction, there's a feminist element in this translation, making it a feminist translation. Let's take one more example in which the writing around a translation itself brings out feminist lines of thought more explicitly. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an activist who led a committee of feminist pioneers to produce the Woman's Bible, which was published in New York in 1895 and 1898. Their project, which they knew was controversial, offers commentaries on those Bible passages, to quote the preface, directly referring to women, and those also in which women are made prominent by exclusion. As the preface points out, that's about 1/10 of scripture by their count. It goes on to say a little bit about their method, that these commentaries will involve the work of, quote, 2 or 3 Greek and Hebrew scholars who will devote themselves to the translation and the meaning of particular words and texts in the original. The others will devote themselves to biblical history, old manuscripts. And third, and most directly, so you know exactly where we are, that for the commentaries on the plain English version, a committee of some 30 members has been formed. These are women of earnestness and liberal ideas, quick to see the real purport of the Bible as regards their sex. Among them, the various books of the Old and New Testament will be distributed for comment. It's clear in this preface that the whole purpose of the project is to push back firmly against readings of the Bible that have served to facilitate, justify, provide reasons for the oppression of women in American society. So what we get, to take an example, is in chapter 2 of Genesis. There's a not particularly remarkable translation of the text, for example, of verse 22, which reads, "And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he a woman, and brought her unto the man." In a commentary that is signed ECS, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, at the end, Stanton calls that image of woman being formed from the rib of the man, she calls it a, quote, "petty surgical operation," going on to add that it's only on this allegory it is on this allegory that all the enemies of women rest their battering rams to prove her inferiority. Accepting the view that man was prior in the creation, some scriptural writers say that as the woman was of the man, therefore her position should be one of subjection. Granted, then as the historical fact is reversed in our day, and the man is now of the woman, shall his place be one of subjection? So if you're saying there that because men, as babies, are born from women, that's then reversing the role, so shall his place be one of subjection? Now, as enjoyable as these and others historical examples might be, these kinds of feminist translation that I'm just aware of have a nagging sense might still seem a bit unenticing if you think about what a feminist translation might do today. Reading a feminist translation that updates a text, as we've seen, that works best if you already know the original text, probably in another English translation. And meanwhile, footnotes and commentaries are all very well if that's the sort of thing you like. But in both cases, it's requiring more reading from the reader, which will not suit everyone. What, though, if you actually just want a translation that you can sink into, enjoy in a comfy chair, to enjoy and encounter a classic text for the first time? Well, that takes me to my third kind of translation after supplementing and adding prefaces and footnotes. I've not got a good name for this, but let's call it shining new light on the original text. It's always worth thinking about the images that we're using to talk about translation. This is one that we're about to see current contemporary translators using themselves, shining new light. The idea of a faithful translation, for example, to take another image briefly, translations don't necessarily need to be literal, and that language of faithful itself can sound a bit gendered and vexed, especially if it's being used to describe the work of women translators faithfully translating the work of male writers from the past. Shining new light is an attractive choice potentially for describing the work of feminist translators, because it suggests that the translation will offer new insights into the original text, into the source text, whilst also avoiding adding or supplementing new ideas that aren't there in the original, shining new light. Now, I'm sure we could find examples from the past in English translation, but I want to leap straight to examples from the present. Shining new light, shining clear light, is an example that the classical scholar Emily Wilson, the classic scholar Emily Wilson, has used to describe her well-received translation of Homer's Odyssey, first printed in 2018, and later printed in a Norton critical edition for students who are encountering the Odyssey in English for the first time. To be clear, neither that first edition nor its later editions have foregrounded that she is the first woman to translate the Odyssey in full into English, or to promote it as a feminist translation. Indeed, her Twitter profile used to state that she was not, capital letters, the first woman to translate the poem into English. That's alluding, I think, to a French translation. There's also a version by Barbara Leonie Picard that's a children's retelling in the mid-20th century. Instead, that translation foregrounds the fact that it's a translation in iambic pentameter. Nonetheless, in the introduction to her translation, Wilson does mention that, quote, "I try to avoid importing contemporary types of sexism into the ancient poem, instead shining a clear light on the particular frames of sexism and patriarchy that do exist in the text, which are only partly familiar from our world." Now, with that quotation, let's just pause over it, because there are two separate ideas here, which, to follow that image of shining new light, are first of all that the feminist translator is revealing something that is there in the text, shining a clear light on the particular frames of sexism and patriarchy that do exist in the text. And then secondly, it says something about the quality of the light being shone, that light doesn't have a misogynistic, patriarchal filter on it, but is shining a clearer light on the text as a result. So that image of shining new light is saying something about the text, is revealing something about the text by shining the light, and also saying something about the kind of light that's being shone on the text. In another piece, separate from the translation, that reflects on much greater length on her translation of the Odyssey as a feminist project, This is in a book that's co-edited by another lecturer at Birmingham, Elena Theodora Popoulos. Wilson talks through why her approach would be valuable alongside some of the other approaches that we've been thinking about. It helps us think through what shining new light might offer. This is a long quotation, but I think it's worth reading in full. Wilson writes that it would be possible for a feminist translator simply not to translate androcentric texts like the Odyssey. One might instead choose to translate the works of neglected non-Anglophone, non-white women writers, although there are not many of these surviving in ancient Greek. Or one might choose to produce not a translation, but a creative response to Homer, like Alice Oswald's Memorial or Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad, to give two more examples of feminist retellings, creative responses to these works. She goes on, but if no feminists translate classical texts, then students and general readers will have to rely on translations that inscribe uncritical modern assumptions about sex and gender. I felt a responsibility to provide Greekless readers with a reliable, authoritative substitute for the Greek text that would take its complex representations of social inequality, including gender equality, more seriously than I felt had been done before. In other words, previous translations, which were primarily by elderly white men from previous generations, that will reflect, be conditioned by their particular social and intellectual positions, will likely be limited, contingent on some way on their particular position as a result, and will probably not take full account of feminist insights or gender equality, for example, or post-colonial insights, to take another example. What does this kind of light-shining feminist translation, what might it look like? Let's look at an example closely. We're in Book 19 of the Odyssey, when Odysseus has finally arrived back on Ithaca, disguised as a beggar, and he's thinking about murdering the suitors who have set up home in his home, seeking his wife Penelope's hand. The curtain is rising in Book 19 on a psychological drama as Odysseus and Penelope encounter each other, and it's not clear exactly when Penelope works out that the beggar is her returned husband. In lines 47 to 52, near the start of Book 19, we're told about Odysseus thinking about his next actions when Penelope enters for the first time. The two finally come face to face again. First, here's the translation from the Loeb Classical Library, translated by A.T. Murray and revised by George Dimmock many decades ago, which we can expect to be a fairly literal English translation, one that's printed opposite the ancient Greek text. That text reads, as Odysseus encounters Penelope for the first time, but noble Odysseus was left behind in the hall, planning with Athene's aid the death of the suitors. Then wise Penelope came forth from her chamber like Artemis or golden Aphrodite. Let's take a second translation, one by A.V. Ryu, which was the first ever book in the Penguin Classics series in 1946, and went on to sell millions of copies. It describes a very similar setup. Odysseus was left once more in the hall, planning the slaughter of his rivals with Athene's help. The wise Penelope now came down from her apartment, looking as lovely as Artemis or golden Aphrodite. There's nothing seems particularly controversial about those descriptions, but if you just think a little bit more about them, we can pick up hints that this scene is being framed in a particular way. Odysseus has arrived back home. He has the goddess Athena as a helper to help achieve his violent goals that aren't really questioned, and now his apparently devoted wife is coming down the stairs to meet him, resembling a goddess, as Ryu very subtly emphasizes, in that she's kept herself looking stunningly beautiful in this time. Odysseus' perspective is taken as the one that we're following. It's not questioned here. And there's a bit of an implication that Odysseus is the one who's gone out to work and come home and all is right again, that he's back, while Athena is there to help him, and Penelope is too, to provide support and look pretty. But let's see what Wilson's translation of that same passage, how that departs from these and other more recent translations of the passage as she translates it into English, primarily by complicating things just a little bit, leaving a little bit of uncertainty in the scene as it's described in this key opening moment. Wilson translates as follows: Odysseus stayed in the hall, still plotting with Athena how to destroy the suitors. Then the queen, her wits about her, came down from her room like Artemis or Aphrodite. So the events are the same, but the choices that Wilson is making as she translates into English are complicating that power balance between Odysseus and Penelope. Odysseus's plans are starting to be queried. They've been described as more sinister sounding plots, and Athena is placed on the same level as Odysseus in working on plotting with Athena how to destroy the suitors. When Penelope is described, she is called a queen, and rather than just being called wise, a common adjective, she's described as remaining cautious, her wits about her. And the goddess comparison is downplayed, so that her beauty is not mentioned. Penelope is portrayed in Wilson's translation as following the expectations of her role as a wife, but also holding something back, being cautious, suspicious, wary at this moment. And so if you think of Wilson's translation as shining light, that image again, well, we're seeing her translation is representing the scene that is there, the imbalances of Odysseus, the one returning home, and Penelope coming down from her room to meet him. But it's also resisting overplaying that dynamic, overplaying the way that Penelope is serving Odysseus, resisting overplaying how we see things from Odysseus' perspective, and instead offering an insight into Penelope's thinking, her role, her motivations. It's creating a balance so that we as readers can see both perspectives at once. Now, this is just one moment, one small moment in a much larger translation. You might wonder if this is conscious on Wilson's part or not. It can be difficult to tell at any single moment across the translation. And if you're thinking about whether you want to read translations, or maybe you're concerned that this is just one reading of the poem, one that departs from that early tradition of male translators of the poem, I think it's worth pointing out there's no necessary reason that earlier tradition of earlier male translations represented by Rieu and Murray's older ones, as I've just quoted here, is automatically more authoritative just because they've been around for a while and there are lots of them. As I suggested at the start, there's no such thing as a neutral translation of a literary text. There will always be partial, shining a particular light on the text, and that's why we still need new translations for each generation, including ones that offer feminist insights. You might also wonder about the overlap between the three strategies that I've talked about and I've introduced here. Wilson also writes a preface and an essay about her translation to help explain it to the readers, a separate essay. And you might also wonder whether in places shining light might come to seem to add in details. I don't necessarily see that's what we're seeing in this example, but others listening closely to the ancient Greek might wonder if the poem is being ambiguous or unambiguous in the same places and the same ways that the original text is. Wilson's translation is offering some hint that feminist translation might starting to get some traction, the idea of it, in more mainstream discourse in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and elsewhere. Finally, Maria Dahvana Headley's follow-up to the success of her novel The Mere Wife is Beowulf, a new translation from 2020, retitled on amazon.co.uk as, quote, Beowulf, a new feminist translation of the epic poem. Another sign it's possibly just becoming a little bit more common to speak about feminist translation. This translation is also advertised as, quote, a radical new verse translation of the epic poem which brings to light elements that have never before been rendered into modern English. In her introduction, Headley uses more light imagery, explaining her desire to shine a light, that phrase again, on the motivations, actions, and desires of the poem's female characters, as well as to clarify their identities. I can see and sense that in the Anglo-American publishing industry at least, shining a light is a useful phrase, a helpful image that fits with associating translations as being closer to the original works rather than creative responses, as I think people are used to thinking about with translations, but also offers a way to think about what a feminist insight might bring to a translation. Now, you might take Headley at her word, that she is just shining a light. But again, you might ask that question if she's adding new ideas in places. And again, I've stressed that's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a slightly different thing for us to be aware of. For me, there is some evidence that she's supplementing the translation in places with her own readings. So for example, she recasts Grendel's mother not as a Helagast in one place in the Old English, a spirit of hell, which, for example, Seamus Heaney translates as hell brute. She translates that word as hellion, a North American slang equivalent, more or less, to the British English little devil. In another example, has been often quoted in the reviews of this translation, when she plays up the competitive, the aggressive laddishness of the male warriors in this poem. She does this right in the opening word of the poem, which is what in Old English, which she translates not as listen, not as hark, or lo, or so, as it has been translated, but as bro instead. The larger point here that I've been trying to make is that it's every reader's choice how you read translations for yourself and how you interpret them, but at a more basic level, which translations you read. It's the reader's choice which translation of these classic texts you want to read, and it's important that there is a range for us to choose from, because these translations are each doing different work. And I think feminist translation absolutely has a place in that transition, that tradition, and the range from which we read, and there's a need for more of them at the moment. We've seen from these examples of Whitney, of Carson, of Tyler, Stanton, Wilson, Headley, they show us that translations, feminist translations, can be very different things. They can be retellings, they can have introductions and notes that are worth not skipping but lingering over. They can discard sexist associations that the text has acquired in order to expose those associations that are present in the original text. Feminist translation takes many different forms, none of them perfectly objective, because literary translations never are, I'd say. These translators that I've introduced, they help me consider how feminist insights can expand our sense of what these classic works of literature might mean to us today, and help those works grow into our ever-evolving present moment. Thanks for listening.